hı.
Meeting is recorded diyor. Tamam, eyvallah. Problem yok. Başlayalım mı?
Başlayalım hocam. Ben kısa bir takdim konuşması yapayım. Değerli Avrazi Araştırma Enstitüsü seminer serileri izleyicileri, bu haftaki konuğumuz Profesör Doktor Cem Karadeli. Kendisi Ufuk Üniversitesi'nden Uluslararası İlişkiler Bölümü Başkanı. Kendisini uzmanlık alanları arasında güvenlik konuları bulunmakta. Güvenlik ana uzmanlık konularından birisi ve bugün de oldukça güncel ve önemli konulardan birisi olan European Security in the Wake of War in Ukraine konusunu ele alacağız. Bu konuda umarım güncel bilgiler içerisinde zengin ve bilgilendirici bir seminer olacağına ben şahsen inanıyorum. Hocam sözü daha fazla uzatmadan size devredeyim.
Teşekkür ederim. İngilizce değil mi bu arada?
İstediğiniz gibi. İngilizce tercihen ama isterseniz
tamam.
Türkçe de olabilir.
Tamam, yok İngilizce hazırlandım da şimdi İngiliz Türkçe olunca
tabii.
sordum. Tamam. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Professor Cem Karadeli. As our esteemed guest Cengiz Han Bey said, I'm the head of Department for Political Science and International Relations Department of Ufuk University in Ankara, Turkey. And today I'd like to talk about the European security in the wake of the war in Ukraine. And during this talk, I will have 3 different sections, and I'll take about half an hour. So, and after that, we'll be having questions, as I understand. Now, for this presentation, I had a PowerPoint, which I'm now actually sharing. So it's, as I said, European security in the wake of the war in Ukraine. But to understand that, we have to do 3 different things. Firstly, we have to talk about what European security concepts were before the beginning of the war and how seriously the concept of security was being taken in European perspective. Secondly, we will talk about the current situation. And thirdly, we'll talk about the developments which may follow in Europe and in general in world system, in the international system. So to begin with, the concept of European security, when we are looking at it from the very beginning, European security was not taken as seriously as it were today, because people were thinking that, especially with the start of the European Union, and it consisted of 27 different nation states, the possibility of war in Europe was next to zero. So, as a result, there were 2 main institutional security structures Europeans relied on. First one was NATO, because the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was a protective institution, firstly established against any Soviet aggression towards Western Europe. And nowadays, it is an organization which relies heavily on scientific research, social policies, cyber terrorism, and so forth, in addition to normal everyday security issues. So NATO, as many of the more than half of the EU members are NATO members as well, then NATO was the first and foremost agency people were turning towards in terms of security, establishing a threat against anyone who's willing to attack the area of Central and Western Europe with that. So also after the end of the Cold War, we have a NATO expansion towards the east, beginning with Czechoslovakia of the time, which then became Czech and Slovak republics, and Hungary. Now we have Romania in it and so forth. So NATO expansion towards east meant less danger present for the Western European powers. However, no one actually believed in a case of hot war, real war. So Europeans were focusing their efforts in international peacekeeping missions, in international military operations which have nothing to do with European security. For instance, French were in Mali, British were in Iraq in Afghanistan with the Americans, and so forth, and no one was thinking European peace might be broken. Another factor obviously contributing to this issue was the fact that the world was financially and technologically and in terms of trade was one due to the globalization and its effect. So people were thinking, well, Russians might be aggressors potentially against Europe, but we have very good financial and trade relations with them, so nothing will happen from that. However, on 20th of February 2022, things changed because the Russian military operations in the Ukraine have begun. Now, two other institutions, in addition to NATO, that existed but didn't actually do much were Common European Defense and Security Concept and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. Now, these were mainly operations that actually emphasizing on security and not defense. Common European Defense and Security Concept of the European Union was an European Union institution which was not really very much contributed by the members. Secondly, outside the European Union, we have the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, and it was, and probably still is, one of the most important security organizations for Europe, because it's a Eurasian and Euro-Atlantic community, and it has 57 participants. If we look from a European perspective, as far from Canada to the other side towards Vladivostok in Russia. However, obviously, if we look from a global perspective, then what we are describing from Canada to Siberia is actually very narrow from the west coast of Canada and east coast of the Russian Federation. But obviously what we mean is that it stretches all through Eurasia and northern American continent. Now, we also had and have European Defense Agency. It has its roots in the Eurogroup and Independent European Program Group, which were essentially NATO committees, which then were transferred to Western European Union, which is again a EU-related program. And Western European Armament Group was terminated by 2005. And in their place, the European Union has established European Defense Agency. But the problem with European Defense Agency was that it was narrowing the scope of the previous defense programs, because at the end of the day, there are NATO members who are not part of the European Union, such as my country, Turkey. So what happens in this environment is that many who were happy to be part of NATO and Western European Union have become outsiders to the European Defense Agency, and it didn't matter much to the EDA members, because EDA was some sort of a hypothetical thing, because EU member states were adamant that they wouldn't need to be defended against foreign aggression, or invasion, or occupation, whatever you call it. However, NATO remained the most important protection for other European countries. Other European countries meaning Turkey, for instance, or Western Balkan countries and Eastern Balkan countries. Also, in the Eurasian scheme, in the Black Sea region, obviously there is Georgia, there is Ukraine, and there is Finland, who wanted to become NATO members, but were not exactly very sure, or NATO was not very sure, because what happened in Georgia with the conflict with the Russians, and what happened with Ukraine's relationships with European countries, and its shaggy report about human rights and so forth. So all these changed on the 20th of February this year, because, well, the Russians were actually encircling or laying siege to Ukraine by placing their troops near the Russian-Ukrainian border all around, trying to take a concession from the Ukrainian government in the issue of NATO membership or non-membership, so that Russia will be happy with its political goals. However, Ukrainian leadership did not cave in, and at the end of February, on the 20th of February, the Russian military operation began in Ukraine. In the 2.5 months since the military conflict's beginning, Russian troops secured territorial gains in the eastern region and southern parts of Ukraine, connecting the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk to previously Russian-occupied Crimean Peninsula. They also had the Azov Sea under their control. So this may be understood as a Russian victory. However, the Russian idea was to actually force a regime change to install a pro-Russia government and then maybe invade capital city Kiev. These did not happen. So from one side, it's a victory because the Russians actually managed to liberate the areas they were concentrating on and gained territories and sea lands, maritime victories, let's say. And yet, on the other hand, everyone, including myself, were thinking, well, they will go until the Dnieper, divide Ukraine into two, into a Russian-controlled and Orthodox part and Ukrainian-controlled and Catholic part, which has better ties with Poland. So that did not happen. However, what happened is that European countries, from Turkey to Portugal, from Britain to Finland, were shocked. And the European Union, probably for the very first time in its history, managed to condemn Russia's actions and agreed unanimously at first on some sanctions against Russian Federation. Now, when it comes to implementing sanctions, the first group of sanctions concerning taking Russian financial system out of the world financial system or Western financial system, closing some money transfer operations to Russian banks and institutions, boycotting some Russian products, forcing some EU and American companies to leave Russian markets, and so forth. These sanctions worked quite well. However, when it came to sanctions concerning energy, either in terms of not buying natural gas and petroleum from Russian Federation or not paying them in Russian rubles as they wanted, things began to change. For instance, the most important economy of the European Union, Germany, said that they were willing to pay in Russian currency to obtain Russian natural gas. So did Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, and so forth. On the other hand, Bulgaria and Poland refused to pay for gas from Russia in Russian rubles, and hence the natural gas transfer to these two countries were cut off. So, on the one hand, there are countries like Poland and Bulgaria who are suffering in terms of energy sources, heating sources, for insisting on a principle, and there are those like Germany who don't actually feel like this is what should be happening. Now, European Union also began to take European security more seriously. France, in particular, was very adamant in establishing a standing European army, furthering European strategy, furthering European security, and so on and forth. But the others, especially Germany and East Europeans, were not very willing to participate in France's ideas in that respect. However, now a common European defense policy was drawn for the very first time in EU history. On 21st of March 2022, just about 30 days after the Russian occupation of Ukraine began, the European Union's defense and foreign ministers met, and a new strategy titled Strategic Compass was accepted. It was a turning point for the European Union as a security provider and an important step for the European security and defense policy, said Josep Borrell, the Spanish diplomat who was head of the EU diplomatic service. So it was a very important thing, and EU was to have a rapid deployment force which would include up to 5,000 soldiers from member states. They would have regular live land exercises and sea exercises. And member states' defense expenditures actually dramatically increased because they now realized that the European Union was not focusing very much on weapons development or military training because they were thinking they were extremely safe. It was proven that they were not. So reliance on NATO was to diminish, and the European Union would go for its own way to secure its defense and security environment. However, there are some East European countries, the Baltic states, and Poland. They were not very much in league with these ideas, but they still didn't do anything to stop the Strategic Compass initiative. And the reason for their unsurety, let's say, they're being unsure of the situation, is because they were relying mostly on NATO and the United States, and they didn't want to offend these two by starting an EU military branch. However, with the Armenian-Azerbaijan war of 2020, the 44 days war, and the Russian operations in Ukraine, the balance has changed, and the Strategic Compass initiative gained ground because these countries which did not actually want to be participating in such a thing began to understand that they should find a European way to secure their borders. So from now on, the Strategic Compass plans will be about strengthening member states' ability to jointly fund research and development projects on their capability requirements, and therefore research and development in arms and defense projects will be funded and conducted in different parts of the European Union, depending on the ability of member states' contribution into such developments or such research. And the main idea behind Strategic Compass initiative is that they want to create, the European Union wants to create a next generation military equipment arsenal, which is completely made in Europe, which would give them advantage against Russians, Americans, Chinese, and will stop reliance for spare parts and other issues. So, strategic compass also emphasizes that the European security and defense policy should be implemented, not relying on NATO, not relying on United States or Turkey or other non-member states, but within the European Union and for the European Union by the year 2030, which is quite near. It's only 7.5 years from now. In that regard, the strategic compass comprises of 4 areas. 1, to act more quickly and decisively when European Union faces crisis of defense or security nature. 2, European Union should secure its citizens against fast-changing threats. This may include the Russian military operation in Ukraine, for instance, but it may also include cyber attacks, financial threats, international systemic crises, and so forth. Thirdly, the EU should invest in capabilities and technologies. And finally, partnering with others to achieve common goals. Now, the others obviously include other NATO members like Canada, United States, and Turkey, and other non-member states like the Middle Eastern and North African region, or the Mediterranean Basin region, or such strategic partners as Georgia in the Caucasus. So, if strategic compass initiative actually works, then this would make quite a contribution to European independence in terms of research and development at the field of defense. And it will be better for them to actually create weaponry, airplanes, strategic defense mechanisms, and so on and forth, because this issue would mean not relying on United States, not relying on American research and development in terms of Europe's defense. For instance, the F-35 fighter plane project of the United States is nagging and nagging and nagging and nagging and lagging behind, and there is nothing coming out of it, and many European countries invested on this. So it's an important issue, and it's an important problem for modernization of European defense. Now, obviously, with the European security being questioned, many countries that were thinking about whether or not to join NATO became extremely interested in a further NATO expansion. Now, first off, obviously, Ukraine is the country which is occupied and which is taking damage from Russian artillery. So immediately within the few days of Russian military operations beginning, President of Ukraine, Zelensky, has applied to both NATO and the European Union for membership. And obviously, either organization were not much interested. However, NATO members began to support Ukraine by sending financial aid, by making Russian dependency on certain materials worse for them, by not selling them any spare parts and raw materials. And on the other hand, by sending Ukraine planes, tanks, artilleries, unmanned aerial devices, drones, and so on and forth. So this is an interesting war at the moment because it's a war of attrition now. On the one hand, there is the Russians, and on the other hand, we have the Europeans and Americans supporting Ukraine. And I'm now realizing that it's been half an hour that I'm speaking, so I'll speed up a bit. I have a few more things to say. Now, Georgia has always wanted to become a NATO member, but obviously with Ajaria and South Ossetia being separatist parts in its territory, and with the Russian support for these, it is highly unlikely again. Finland, which had fought and won against Soviet Union in the Winter War in 1939, is also considering a NATO membership. However, it is obviously European security from the EU perspective up now. When we look at the Russian side, things are different in two issues. Firstly, the Russian Federation actually wanted to prevent other countries who were willing to be NATO members to continue on their path by invading NATO. So they wanted to prevent others to join NATO by creating a threat to them, showing them what happens to Ukraine will happen to actually Baltic countries or Finland or Poland or wherever who wants to be NATO members in what they consider to be a Russian sphere of influence, and Georgia, obviously. So now that the war did not go as planned for the Russian forces, they could not invade Kiev, they could not dethrone Zelensky and the Ukrainian regime, they could not change much things. They only achieved military success in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, but that was far behind and below their expectations. And so NATO and EU are now being considered as powerful strategic actors vis-a-vis Russia in this situation. And countries which were hesitant to become member of either organizations now are willing. Secondly, though, the Ukrainian operation helped Russia in a way because it tightened its relations with the two most populated countries on earth, India and China, and the Western boycott on services and products started a new era in international trade and finance, proving Europe is not as important as it thinks it is, and proving that you don't need to rely on Western in general and European in particular resources to continue to be part of the world financial system. So now Chinese banks, Chinese modes of payment are replacing, say, MasterCard or Western banks or financial products and services. And India has become a huge market for the petroleum and natural gas Russia cannot sell to European countries anymore. And India is living a boom in its economy thanks to Russian petroleum pouring into its economy. So this is a game changer in the way we think about the West. Also, Russia is now demanding payments in its currency, in Russian ruble. And as a result, international trade is not completely dependent on US dollar anymore. And this is a very important development. Also, Putin used the operation to consolidate his power, his popularity, Russian people's support for Slavonic unity, while using the operation in Ukraine as an excuse to detain his opponents. And also, when we look at the general picture, yes, there are many protesters in Russia who are against the war, but there are far more people who believe in the victory and who believe that it was a good thing to operate against Ukraine. For instance, again, in late March, you've seen, or early March, you've seen a young Russian gymnast called Ivan Kulyak, who went to take his medal in a gymnastic competition with the Z put on his uniform. Now, this is one thing that Putin achieved to consolidate his power. Secondly, in this new aspect, Russia was able to show the rest of the world that West is not as liberal or tolerant or loving freedom of expression as it claims to be. Because at the end of the day, at the moment, in any Google-powered or Apple-powered phones, you cannot download RIA Novosti or Sputnik News. If you had them before, you can use them. If not, they don't exist anymore in any Western country, including Turkey. So if you cannot hear what the other side is saying in an argument, this isn't exactly defending freedom of speech, is it? So that's an important issue, I think, that Europe has to look at. The UEFA ban on Russian teams entering European competitions for 2022 and 2023 is another sign that European powers are trying to punish Russia in a war they are not actually part of. And that's what makes this Ukrainian war very interesting. It's a war of attrition for the Europeans and Americans, and they support one side and are putting sanctions against the other side a lot, and yet they actually keep saying they are not part of this war while doing everything to support Ukraine. So it's again showing us that European powers are kind of doing what they used to do in the 19th century, send a gunboat to a country they have a problem with and then be happy about it. So another thing is all these actions brought into account the fact that globalization is now has now numbered days, because the world was actually going towards what we call gated globalization, which means blocks of trade or trading blocks are putting restrictions to the import of products from different countries and so on already. But now, because Chinese banking system and financial facilities are active in the European, in Ukraine, I'm sorry, what am I talking about? In Russia and in many East European and East Eurasian countries, things are getting far faster towards the world of gated globalizations. Now we will again probably turn to 1920s, in which we had gold standard and countries would trade in trading zones instead of establishing a huge globalization. We would have EU region, One Belt, One Road Initiative region, North American and Pacific region, and so on and forth. So it will be an interesting world to look at, and the role of the European Union in such diversified financial and service systems is very interesting to look at when the time comes. Now, also, it's not certain that despite harming European image, harming globalization, and turning Russia into creating its own trading zone, the sanctions actually did not harm the Russian Federation as people were beginning thinking. As a result, these sanctions only strengthened regionalism against globalism. Also, in terms of politics, even though the EU seemed to be acting as a single actor at the beginning, when national interests of individual member states began to come into issue, as in the issue with natural gas purchases and so forth, then things have began to change. And as a result, now there are EU members who want further sanctions against Russian Federation, and those who are against further sanctions against against Russian Federation. Politically, also, it is very interesting to see that who actually supports the Russian position in Ukraine are not who we think they would. I mean, traditionally, when Russians and before then Soviet Union did something in world politics, communist parties, socialist groups, trade unions, workers' unions, they all supported the Russian and before that Soviet steps. However, now the European left is completely supporting the Ukrainian case, while the far right in Europe is supporting Russians. Now, in the last French presidential elections, one thing that really became a point against Le Pen, Marine Le Pen, the head of French far right, was her ties with Putin and the Russian support for her and her support towards the Russian activities in Ukraine. Now, in the same elections, Macron and Mélenchon, the far left candidate, all were against Russian operations in Ukraine and for Russians to leave Ukraine. So it's an interesting thing. Also, in the European Parliament, again, in terms of freedom of expression, there is this group called Identity and Democracy, which includes all the racist parties, all the far-right parties, and so on. And what's interesting is that they too decided to join other 7 groups of the European Parliament in signing a declaration against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but they were excluded by other groups from putting on their signature into the document, and that obviously created a problem in the general political environment of the European Parliament. Now, to sum up, the Russian aggression towards Ukraine gave us economic and financial void created in Russia by Western companies and Chinese companies and services filling this gap, this forcing us into a new era in globalization. To strengthening of European foreign policy and beginning of a unison which might truly evolve into a common foreign and defense policy for the European Union. Thirdly, countries which were sitting on the fence, which were indecisive about whether to join NATO or EU, applying to become a EU member, now are willing to join these, but for the wrong reasons. By wrong reasons, I mean not for policy or economics reasons, but because of defense reasons. Also, European Union and European Parliament seem to be in good unison against Russian occupation of Ukraine, but as the process goes towards harming national, financial, and energy interests of countries within the EU, then there will be fractions in this unified voice. Again, the drive from globalization towards regionalization and gated globalization due to the tensions between Russia and the West is seeming imminent. Also, indifference from non-regional countries towards the ethics of war and an emphasis by those countries towards their national interests and profits rather than supporting Ukraine or proving their good relations with the European Union is apparent. India is very important in these terms. China is, again, supporting Russia in terms of finances, in terms of facilities, in terms of services, and in terms of policies. And finally, in the light of these issues, it can be concluded that European military security has become a more important issue. The European defense will take a far more important place than it previously had, and we will see a far more defense and security-oriented European Union in particular, Europe in general, and Western world in even more general picture. I'm sorry I continued for too long, and thank you for listening to me. So if you have any questions, please.
Were already answered within the presentation, so I didn't put them again to not repeat them. So if there's no questions, I would like to thank again Professor Cem Karadeli for sparing time today, joined us in our seminar series, presented his own topic in the, as I mentioned, in an important and actual hot topic, we can say, and we have seen different perspectives. We have talked different aspects, neighboring countries, even touch upon other multidisciplinary issues like economy and other issues also. So I would like to thank again Professor Cem Karadeli and for our audience for attending our meeting today. So I hope I will see you all in our continuing seminar series. Thank you for your attention and thank you for participating in it. Hocam tekrardan teşekkür ederiz sizlere.
Teşekkür ederim, çok sağ olun.
Bugün müdürümüz Doçent Doktor Vakur Smar Bey de katılacaktı. Yalnız seminardan önce bir programla çıkması nedeniyle başka yere katılmak zorunda kaldılar. Onlar özürlerini iletmişlerdi. Ben de kendileri katılır mı diye bekledim de muhtemelen orada toplantı uzun sürdü. Onlar da size iletmemi istemişti. Hocam Atayurt'tan Anayurt'a selamlar gönderelim ve böylece kapatalım. Tekrar teşekkür ederiz.
Çok teşekkür ederiz, çok sağ olun. Birlikte inşallah daha çok işler yapmak üzere diyelim.
İnşallah hocam, inşallah. So